to my tutorial on chapter 9 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. So as I've done before, I'm going to be reading the chapter and pausing quite regularly to kind of talk you through the narrative and the language features and the main things to look out for. Okay. Right, so the main thing to remember is that coming into this chapter, we effectively we've finished the whole of the main part of the narrative. So everything involving Utterson now is finished. Everything that we hear in this chapter, chapter 9, and the last chapter, chapter 10, is all the things that are inside the envelopes that Mr. Utterson now has inside his safe. Okay, this first of the two chapters, chapter 9, is all from the point of view of Dr. Lanyon. Now, if you remember, Dr. Lanyon was the very old friend of Dr. Jekyll, but they fell out over some what was referred to as some unscientific balderdash. Following the Carew murder case, when we know as the reader, or we find out later as the reader, that Dr. Jekyll has been trying to make amends for it by becoming a good person and by not turning into Hyde, Dr. Jekyll and Dr. Lanyon become quite good friends again. And if you remember, we have the chapter, I think it's chapter 5, where it begins with a dinner party, and we hear that the two doctors have become quite friendly again, and Utterson is quite happy about this fact. But then very quickly afterwards in the same chapter, we learn that something happens to Dr. Lanyon, and Mr. Utterson visits him, and he's a very, very changed man. He's very ill, and he's referred to as being literally on his deathbed. And Dr. Lanyon himself knows that he hasn't got very long left, and within a couple of days, he's actually died. And it's all very, very sudden, given that Dr. Lanyon was a man who seemed very, very solid and in good health, and there didn't seem any reason for him to die quite so suddenly. But we know that Dr. Lanyon is somehow involved in whatever it was that's happened with Dr. Jekyll. Okay, so if you remember at the end of chapter 8, after the dead body of Mr. Hyde was found in the cabinet in Dr. Jekyll's house, Mr. Utterson went back home with the envelope that he found in the cabinet that was addressed to him, only to be read on the death of Dr. Jekyll or the disappearance. And he's also gone back home to read these two quite lengthy narratives. So the first one here is the narrative from Lanyon. So everything that we hear now in this chapter is told from a first person perspective from Dr. Lanyon, and that's very, very important, because up until this point of the novel, everything has been third person narrative, with a bias towards Mr. Utterson, because obviously he's our narrator, or rather he's not our narrator, sorry, he's the person that we as the reader have quite a bond with, and he's kind of our eyes and ears in the story. All right, so everything that we're going to read in this chapter now was written before Dr. Lanyon died. So it was written probably a few weeks or months previous to the end of the story, and it's kind of filling in some of the gaps. It's filling in some of the bits of information that we as a reader are still unaware of. Now, don't forget, when this was written in the late 1800s, people were not, that they didn't know the story at all. As a modern reader today, we know that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person, and that Dr. Jekyll took a potion. The people back in the Victorian times when it first came out didn't have a clue about this. Okay, and it's all playing into this idea of the dual nature of man. So man's two sides of their behaviour. Obviously, it's the idea of the good Dr. Jekyll and then the evil Mr. Hyde. All right, but at this point, the Victorian reader would not be aware of the fact that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. So in this chapter here, told in letter form from the first person perspective of Dr. Lanyon, is where we learn this for the very first time. So it's a really important chapter. All right. So up until now, Lanyon has seemed a fairly unimportant character. He's only really appeared twice. Okay, but here now is where we start to have the gaps in the jigsaw, so to speak, filled in. Okay, so we're on chapter 9, and the chapter is even titled Dr. Lanyon's Narrative. So as a reader, that really pinpoints us to the fact that this is going to be first person perspective from Dr. Lanyon. So everything now is you need to imagine that Mr. Utterson has gone home, back to his study, trying to take in everything that's happened, and he opens up the envelopes that have been given to him, and he starts to read aloud. So when he's talking about I in the first person here, it is told from the point of view of Dr. Lanyon. Okay, so chapter 9, Dr. Lanyon's narrative. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope, addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him, indeed, the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify the formality of registration. Now, this letter was obviously written the night after the dinner party that we're told about in chapter 5, right? So if you remember these two old friends, these two doctors have got back friends again, and they'd had a very nice evening at the dinner party. And it begins with Dr. Lanyon receiving this a letter. It refers to correspondence. Correspondence is the word for writing to each other. So he's received a letter off Henry Jekyll, and he's quite confused about this because he says that even though they got back friends again, they weren't in the habit of writing to each other. So he's quite confused as to why Dr. Jekyll will be writing to him like this. Now, what I'm about to read is the letter that Henry Jekyll sent to Dr. Lanyon that night. Right, so we've got Lanyon telling the story, but now the letter that's read aloud is from Henry Jekyll to Dr. Lanyon. The contents increase my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. 10th of December, 18 blank. Now it's important to note there that the chapter begins with on the 9th of January, now 4 days ago. But the letter that he received was dated the 10th of December. So there's a whole month that's gone by for when the letter was written and for when it's sent to Dr. Lanyon, which is a little bit strange. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times in scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. So Dr. Jekyll begins the letter to Dr. Lanyon by saying that even though they haven't they've differed at times on scientific matters, Dr. Jekyll is saying here that he can't remember any break in our affection. In other words, even though they differed on science matters, Dr. Jekyll has always thought very highly on a personal level of Dr. Lanyon. There was never a day when, if you said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honour, my reason depend upon you, I would not have sacrificed my fortune or my left hand to help you. I would not have sacrificed my fortune or my left hand to help you, Lanyon. My life, my honour, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose, after this preface, that I'm going to ask for something dishonourable to grant. Judge for yourself. So the letter then begins with a plea from Dr. Jekyll to Dr. Lanyon to help him in some way. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at your door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Paul, my butler, has his orders. You will find him waiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone, to open the glazed press, letter E, on the left-hand side, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand the fourth drawer from the top, or, which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you. But even if I am in error, you might know the right drawer by its contents: some powders, a file, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. Okay, so in this letter, Dr. Jekyll is basically saying, whatever you are doing, I need you to drop everything and help me straight away. And he instructs him to go to his house, to Dr. Jekyll's house, to the cabinet at the back of the house, and to bring out one of the drawers in there with all of the contents. So everything that's inside the drawer, he needs to bring it back with him, back to Dr. Lanyon's own home. Okay. Now this is a bit bizarre because we as the reader, in fact Lanyon at the time must have been wondering why on earth Dr. Jekyll couldn't go to his house himself and get the drawer out. Now, the reader then is going to be starting wondering what's happening, because we know, or we would suspect by this point as modern readers, that this is perhaps because he is in a state of transformation as Mr. Hyde at the moment, and that he desperately needs the potion to turn back to Dr. Jekyll. Of course, it would be very hard for him just to go knocking on the door of his own house. And be asked to admit entry, because don't forget, he is, as Mr. Hyde is being hunted for the murder of Danvers Carew. So even as Poole is his butler and all the people, servants that work for him, they would not just be able to admit a murder into their house and do nothing about it. The right thing to do, of course, would be to call the police, because this is a very, very wanted man. Okay, but of course Lanyon knows nothing about this at all. He doesn't know about any of the experimentations that Dr. Jekyll has been doing for the transformation of Mr. Hyde at all. But you imagine receiving this letter, wondering what on earth is going on, why this man who yes, you are good friends with, and you have been friends for a long time, but you've only just got reacquainted once again. Why he wants you to do something as personal as go to his house, as to break into the cabinet if necessary, to break into the drawer if necessary, and bring the drawer back to his own home. It's all very, very suspicious. And certainly, if you think about the role of the Victorian gentleman, this expectation is having to go into somebody else's house and do something that's almost class of kind of criminal damage, I suppose, to actually go in and break into the room. But of course, Dr. Jekyll in this letter has also said that Paul has his instructions to break down the door, and to assist Dr. Lanyon in this. Because don't forget, even when he's Mr. Hyde, his handwriting is still the same. That's the one thing that they do have in common between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That's the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. So the next part of the letter goes on to say that if Dr. Lanyon helps Dr. Jekyll in this, and he goes and comes straight back, it should only take him less than an hour. But Henry Jekyll is going to leave it at least an hour, just in case, as he refers to there, he talks about those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen. In other words, if an obstacle, if something comes in the way that he can't predict, that isn't foreseen or that can't be prevented. So he wants to give him enough time. And also, as he says there, an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. So obviously Dr. Jekyll's been a bit suspicious again here, because he's basically saying, I don't want anybody around in your house, any of the servants, to see what will then happen for the second part of the thing that I'm asking you to do. Okay, so back to Henry Jekyll's letter. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. Now, don't forget, Lanyon has never met Mr. Hyde, and that was already kind of kept out for the reader in quite an early chapter, when Utterson went to speak to Lanyon about his concerns over Dr. Jekyll. And if you remember, Utterson said to him, asked him if he'd ever met his protege, Mr. Hyde. And Lanyon, because he hadn't been friends with Jekyll for quite some time, didn't know who this Mr. Hyde was. And that's vital, don't forget, because if Lanyon were to know who he was seeing here, that it was this Mr. Hyde, he would then go straight to the police for the suspicion of the murder of Danvers Carew. So this person, i.e. Hyde, can turn up at Dr. Lanyon's door completely indistinguishable. Dr. Lanyon has never met him, so he doesn't know that this person that's going to come to his house to ask for this drawer with the contents in it is actually going to be Mr. Hyde. And that's probably why Henry Jekyll turns to Dr. Lanyon for this, because he doesn't know, he knows that he's never met Hyde. But I think also because both of them are doctors. So what's about to happen in the chapter is perhaps, that we'll come on to in a minute, is perhaps another reason why Dr. Jekyll chose Dr. Lanyon over somebody else, because they're both men of doctors. Both men of science. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance. Now, in this sense, capital means of the utmost importance, right? And that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they might appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. So this is quite a strong appeal here that Henry Jekyll's making to Dr. Lanyon in this letter. He's basically saying that if you neglect any of these tasks that I've asked you to do, you will have possibly either my death or the shipwreck of my reason on your conscience. Now, the shipwreck of my reason basically means his sanity. So he's basically saying if you fail me in going, if you refuse to go and get the drawer and bring it back and give the drawer to the person that will knock on the door at midnight, you will potentially have my death or my madness on your hands. Now, Lanyon is deliberately kept away from Dr. Jekyll over a lot of things of science, so this is quite a strong ask of him. Really, it's quite unfair, I think, in many ways, of Dr. Jekyll to do this. So back to his letter then. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, trifle just means to mess about with. My heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, labouring under a blackness of distress no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware that if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, Henry Jekyll. Um, and again, going back to this idea that Henry Jekyll puts quite a lot of pressure on Utterson, sorry, not Utterson, on Lanyon here. He's basically saying that if you do as I'm asking you to do, you could save my life. All my troubles will roll away like a story that's told, as he calls it. In other words, if you do this, the whole thing will just seem like a story. Jekyll is also kind of intimating, he's also perhaps implying that 5 minutes after he's given over this drawer to this mystery man, if he wants an explanation, then Dr. Jekyll will give him one. All right, but we don't come to what that explanation is or how he used to get this explanation until a little bit later in the chapter. Okay, so the letter finishes, and underneath it says PS. Now, PS is what we call a postscript, and that's a little bit at the bottom of a letter that you add, usually that you forgot to add in the main body of the letter, or it's something that's usually quite important. So at the bottom of Henry Jekyll's letter, he adds a PS, a postscript. PS. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Jekyll. So in the postscript then, Henry Jekyll has realised that if the post office doesn't deliver this letter to Lanyon in time, it might be too late for him to have done this on the first night. So he's basically saying, if you don't get it until the following day, then do it that day for the following night when the messenger, i.e. Hyde, will appear at your door at midnight as normal. But if he doesn't, then it might already be too late. And look at how fatalistic, so how serious Henry Jekyll is at the end of the postscript when he says, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Okay, so you imagine that somewhere Henry Jekyll, now as transformed into Mr. Hyde, is completely stuck. Okay, if you remember, he gave up his flat in Soho. He had to do after the death of Danvers Carew. He has no money because he can't get to the bank. He can't go into his house because Poole and the servants would recognise him and call the police. So somewhere, Dr. Jekyll, as Mr. Hyde, is in hiding. Right, he's got nothing, and you imagine how desperate he would be because he knows that he's a wanted man. And as we've said before, we're going back to the Victorian times when somebody will be executed if they were found guilty of murder, especially given that Danvers Carew is quite a high-profile victim for Hyde to have killed. Right, so the next paragraph now goes back into Dr. Lanyon's words. So he's read the letter. And in the letter that he is now writing to Utterson, he's talking about what happened next. Okay, so this is the words of Lanyon, not Utterson, not Jekyll. Upon the reading of this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane. So in other words, Dr. Lanyon's first response to the letter is that Jekyll must be insane, must be mad. But till that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. So although Lanyon thinks that he's insane, he actually realises that this is something really quite serious. And he talks about the less I understood of this farrago, the less I was in a position to judge. So in other words, he doesn't understand what's going on, but he realises it's something really quite important. And that's why he and as he talks about there, he says about it could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. Now, grave in this sense means very serious. So he knows that this is something serious, and he knows that it's something that, even though he doesn't know what's going on, he knows that he's got to do this for the sake of his friend. I rose accordingly from the table, got into a hansom is another word for a cab, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. Now, butler, don't forget, is Paul that we've seen quite a lot of in the previous chapter. Paul had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. Right. So when Jekyll had sent the letter to Lanyon, he'd also sent another registered letter. Paul. Now, registered letter means that it's one that is guaranteed to get there because it has to be signed for, and it can be traced. All right. So we start to realise that this is obviously something quite serious. If he's absolutely making sure that Paul received this letter of instructions, and the instructions that Jekyll sent to Paul in his letter to him were to send for a locksmith and a carpenter, and that's because we know that that's for him to actually break into the cabinet for Lanyon to get the drawer out and bring it back to his house. The tradesman came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. So this is the old theatre at the back of the house where the previous doctor of the house used to do his autopsies and things. The door was very strong, the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last man was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked. Now the press, it would be just like glass cabinets with drawers, separate drawers inside them, right? So they've break into the cabinet through the cabinet door, and now they've also then had to break into the press that's marked E, so letter E, to take out the correct drawer. So the press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in sheets, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Cavendish Square is where Dr. Lanyon himself lives. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of a white colour. So everything that's inside this drawer is obviously to do, we know it's to do with the potion that will then return him into Dr. Jekyll. And as Lanyon's commenting on here, the way that the powders have been mixed up is not like a professional, like a dispensing chemist as it refers to, but they must have actually been of Jekyll's private manufacture. So this, the powder mix that he's got is something that is purely the responsibility of Dr. Jekyll. Nobody else has had a hand in this. The phial, now phial is another word for a test tube. The phial to which I next turned my attention might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell. Pungent just means very strong smelling, and seemed to me to contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. Of the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book and contained little but a series of dates. Now these dates must have been when Jekyll started doing his experimentation and turning into Hyde. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Now, this bit here, which talks about the dates, is quite important because it suggests, when it says that the dates covered a period of many years, this suggests that Dr. Jekyll has been doing this experimentation for quite some time. So we don't know how long he's actually been turning into Hyde for, or how long he's just been a little bit obsessive about trying to find a way of doing so. And if you notice, it says, I observed that the entries ceased, so they stopped nearly a year ago and quite abruptly. So about a year ago, the dates in this book of dates suddenly stopped. Now, if we start putting two and two together, that's when we realise that probably that Carew was murdered. So the transformations would have had to have stopped abruptly because, of course, if he was caught, he would be executed. Here and there, a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, such as double, occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation, total failure. So in this book of dates, then, Henry Jekyll has also been jotting down his own little observations with things like double, so perhaps he was having to use double the quantity, and then total failure. So he's obviously, this book contains him sort of tracking the experimentations that he did into Mr. Hyde. All this, though, it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. And the fact that he talks about whetted my curiosity, when you have the word whetted spelled WHETTED, if something whets your appetite or whets your curiosity, it means that inspires your curiosity. So we know that Dr. Lanyon is a man of science. So he's probably a little bit curious now, wondering what this list of dates is that Dr. Jekyll's been writing about in this notebook. Here was a file of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honour, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? Um, so Dr. Lanning is quite confused here because he doesn't quite know how a small amount of this salt, so this powder, um, had this small test tube with some blood-coloured mixture in there, and this notebook could actually affect, as he refers to, the honour, the sanity, or the life of Dr. Jekyll. So he's quite confused as to why this is so important, and why there's this big mystery with a letter and him having to take it and be met at midnight and to tell nobody else. If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? The messenger, of course, is talking about his Hyde, so he's wondering why he could only go to Lanyon's house and nowhere else. But as we've already said, that's because Utterson has never met Hyde. And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received to me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. Now, cerebral is to do with the brain, so he thinks that Dr. Jekyll has gone mad, he's saying. And though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver, that's a gun, that I might be found in some posture of self-defence. So he's a little bit scared that something's going to happen, so he's kind of armed himself. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London before the knocker sounded very gently on the door. I went myself at the summons and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. So this small man we know to be Mr. Hyde. And if you think about the descriptions once again, it refers to as a small man. And the word crouching suggests something quite sort of as though he's hiding. There's nothing sort of bold or about this person here, something quite cowardly. Are you come from Dr. Jekyll? I asked. He told me yes by a constrained gesture. And when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's eye open, and at the sight I thought my visitor started and made greater haste. So the description of this character here, again as we know to be Hyde, but Lanyon doesn't, is all very furtive, it's all very secretive. The fact that he's looking back, there's a backward glance into the darkness. He spots a policeman, and Lanyon thought my visitor started, so he thought he jumped and made greater haste, so ran quickly into the house. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here, at last, I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I'd never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck besides with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and last but not least, with the odd subjective disturbance caused by his neighbourhood. Now, what this means here, because everyone that's met Mr. Hyde at some point in the novel has been quite disturbed by him. There's been something quite unpleasant about him. And as Lanyon says on the first time of meeting him here, he says that he was struck by this combination of muscular activity. So he's quite strong and powerful, even though he's quite small. So muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution. Debility means that something is quite weak, and your constitution is the way that you're built. So we're saying it's really strange that he seems quite powerful and quite wiry and muscular, but actually there's something quite weak about him. And that's because, as we've said before, that the evil within Dr. Jekyll was quite undeveloped, and so therefore the character of Hyde, when he comes out, he's 100% of Dr. Jekyll's evil, but he's still quite undeveloped. And Lanyon also comments on the disturbance caused by his neighbourhood, and what that means is the disturbance in Lanyon's feelings that's caused by this character, Mr. Hyde, being close to him. In other words, in this sense, the word neighbourhood just means being next to him. So this even a quite a strong, powerful gentleman like Lanyon feels quite disturbed, feels quite uneasy by having this man, this very weird man in his house. This bore some semblance to insipid rigour, and was accompanied by marked sinking of the pulse. Now he's talking about himself here, the fact that his pulse starts slowing down. He's obviously is quite distressed, quite concerned here. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms. So Lanyon saying at the time, you put it down to idiosyncratic, just means referring just to your own sort of feelings. So at the time, he puts it down just to some strange distaste of his own towards this man. But of course, we know that having got the bigger picture, that this is exactly how everybody who's met Hyde before has reacted. They felt strange, there's a real strange presence about. But I've since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. So that little second little bit of the sentence there, Lanyon is saying that in hindsight, because obviously he's writing this chapter with everything that's already happened to him, so he knows um, since the first meeting that there is something much deeper that caused him to have such a bad reaction towards Hyde. And he talks about it. It lies much deeper in the nature of man. This person, who had thus, from the first moment of his entrance, struck in me what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement, the trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of the coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. So these clothes, of course, were the clothes of Dr. Jekyll. And it's worth noting here that if he is out and about in these clothes that are too big, he must have made the transformation from Jekyll to Hyde while he was out and about. And that would suggest that this was not a voluntary thing. He did not take the potion to turn into Hyde. This has probably happened when he was out and about as Jekyll, completely unaware of what transformation was about to take place. And as Lanyon said, that if this was in a normal situation, it would be quite laughable that this gentleman was walking around in these very formal clothes that were 2 sizes too big for him. But of course, he doesn't laugh because he's got a real strange feeling about towards this man. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from moving me to laughter. Accoutrement just means clothing. Strange, rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit in with and to reinforce it, so that to my interest in the man's nature and character there was added a curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. So Lanion's saying here that even though it should be something quite laughable, actually it just makes the whole thing more concerning, because he doesn't quite know who this man is and why he's dressed like this, and where he's come from. All right. Note here, please, because this will be one of the questions on the sheet about the way that Dr. Lanyon refers to him when he talks about things like that. There was something seizing, surprising, and revolting. He refers to him as a creature that now faced me. He talks about his curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. So, as much as Dr. Lanyon finds this man quite distressing, he actually wants to find out more about who he is. There's this compulsion to discover where he's from and who he is and what his link obviously is with Jekyll. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with sombre excitement. And look at that lovely oxymoron there, this sombre excitement. Sombre means something quite serious, and obviously that's the total opposite of excitement. So, in other words, this man in front of him, Hyde, there's something, there's this pent up excitement, and he's having to contain himself, of course, but he's obviously desperate to get his hands on that drawer with the contents in. His life literally does depend upon it. "Have you got it?" he cried. "Have you got it?" And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put it back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. And look at that when Lanyon talks about the fact that in his excitement, Hyde kind of grabs his arm. He's that desperate to get hold of the drawer. And he talks about an icy pang along my blood. So when Hyde touches him, his blood literally runs cold. "Come, sir," said I, "you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And here we go back to this idea of gentlemanly behaviour, the fact that we've got this stranger that's coming to his house, and the first thing that he says is, "Have you got it? I need the drawer." And of course, Lanyon kind of takes a step back and tries to put him in his place by saying, "I don't even know who you are, so come take a seat." So we're trying to get a sense of normality here. I showed him an example and sat down myself in my customary seat, and with as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient as the lateness of my hour, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. So Lanyon's just saying here that he tries to set the example and he sits down and hoping that this visitor will take the lead. And even though he's very concerned by what's going on, and it's quite late and he's quite distressed, he's trying to be very, very calm, Lanyon is. And this is why he's a good character for Jekyll to have gone to, because Lanyon is so calm and put together. He doesn't react in an openly negative way, even though he's quite upset and he's concerned as to who this man is and what's going on. "I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon," he replied civilly enough. "What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the insistence of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood—" He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of the hysteria. "I understood a draw." So at this point, Hyde realises that he's got to kind of play the game with Lanyon, that he's got to come across as being polite, and so he apologises for his rudeness. But then underneath it, Lanyon can see that there is a real nervous excitement here. So when he puts his hand to his throat, and it says that he was wrestling against the approaches, the hysteria. Now, hysteria means this kind of mad excitement. So he's trying very hard to keep himself calm, but of course he's desperate to get his hands on that drawer. But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my own growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer where it lay on the floor behind a table and still covered with sheets. He sprang to it and then paused and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws, and his face was so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed both for his life and reason. I mean, look at this. Look at the reaction when he sees the drawer. The fact that he talks about his. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws. There's something very desperate here, and something very, very animalistic here. He's grating his teeth. He's that desperate to get hold of the contents. "Compose yourself," said I. He turned a dreadful smile to me, and as if with the decision of despair, plucked away the sheet. At sight of the contents, he uttered out one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified. And the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control, "Have you a graduated glass?" he asked. A graduated glass would be a piece of science equipment. Okay, but look at this, which is about the immense relief that he notices here. And as a gentleman, the fact that he uttered one loud sigh here, this is all quite ungentlemanly behaviour in the sense that he's very uncomposed in front of a stranger. So we can really feel that the sense of relief from Mr. Hyde here, at the fact that Lanyon has done what he asked him to do. I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which was at first of a reddish hue, began in proportion as the crystals melted, brighten in colour, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapour. So this is just a description of what happens when he puts the liquid and the powder together. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the ebullition ceased. The ebullition just means the bubbling. The ebullition ceased, and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny. "And now," said he, "to settle what remains. Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and to go forth from your house without further parley?" Parley just means talking, conversation. "Or has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide." So this man here, Mr. Hyde, is basically saying to Lanyon, will you be wise? Will you take my advice and let me walk out of here without any more questions? Or has your curiosity got the better of you? Because as he says here, think before you answer, but it shall be done as you decide. In other words, if you will take my advice and let me walk away from here with no further questions and you don't know what's going on, that's better for you. But if you are too curious, then I will stay and show you, but it's your decision and you have got to pay the price of the consequence of whatever happens. All right, now you imagine if that was you, if somebody had asked a really really odd request of you, and they said to you, you can either let me go now and never ask me any questions and never find out what's happened, which is what I'm advising you to do, or you can let your curiosity get the better of you. I think you probably most people probably let curiosity get the better of them. All right. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul. Or, if you shall so prefer to choose, a new province of knowledge and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you, here, in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan. So what he's saying here is basically saying, if you let me walk away from here, you you won't be richer, you won't be wiser, but you will have the gratitude of Henry Jekyll. Or if you prefer to let curiosity get the better and for me to stay, he says here, a new province of knowledge and new avenues of fame and power should be laid open to you here in this room. In other words, he's saying, if you let me stay, or if you want me to stay and show you what I'm about to show you, that a whole new world of scientific discovery will be laid open to you personally here at this moment in this room. All right. I want you to look very carefully at the language that Jekyll uses here. Um, because even though he's saying, my advice to you is let me walk away, look at the language he uses in saying, but if you let me stay and show you, he refers to things like fame and power, a new province of knowledge and new avenues. So it's quite clear that through the voice of Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll is actually very proud of what he's done. Now, as men of science, it would be perhaps too much to ask for Dr. Lanyon not to be curious here. Because you imagine if somebody said to you, I've discovered something incredible here, it will be quite distressing. Most people probably stop and watch what they're about to be shown to satisfy the curiosity and to actually feel as though perhaps they were at the start of something quite important in terms of scientific discovery. Because as we talked about before in class, the Victorian era was the time of massive scientific and medical discoveries. So to be at the forefront of that will probably be the dream of any scientist, really, to be the person that's been there at the start of some kind of breakthrough. Okay, but look at the way that Hyde speaks about this to Lanyon. It almost makes it too tempting for Lanyon to refuse. Sir, said I, affecting a coolness that I was far from truly possessing, you speak enigmas. Enigmas means in riddles or in puzzles. You speak enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief. But I've gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see the end. So Lanyard's reply to Hyde is basically saying, you're talking in riddles. Um, I have a very strong impression no very strong impression of belief. Basically means I kind of don't believe you. I don't believe what you're talking about. But then he says, but I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services. In other words, I've done too much now without an explanation. Pause before I see the end. In other words, I want to see the end of this. So I want you to stay and show me whatever it is you're going to show me. It is well, replied my visitor. Lanyon, you remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. And now, you who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine, you who have derided your superiors, behold. So the first thing that Hyde says here when he says about remember your vows, what follows is under the seal of our profession. This refers to what's called the Hippocratic Oath. And the Hippocratic Oath is an oath that doctors, even today, take. And it basically swears that patient confidentiality. In other words, even if they see something terrible, they cannot talk about it. It goes outside of the Hippocratic Oath. So Hyde is basically saying that what I'm going to show you now, you cannot tell anybody because you will be breaking your Hippocratic oath as a doctor. And it's worth noting actually there that Hyde says it's under the seal of our profession. And of course, Hyde is only a doctor because he's Dr. Jekyll. Okay, but so Dr. Mr. Hyde himself is the doctor, but Jekyll is, so he refers to himself in this point as our. And then he goes on to say, he's quite insulting to Lanyon when he says to him, "You have been so long being bound by the most narrow and material views." So he's accusing Lanyon here of being quite boring, quite dull in his scientific experimentation. It's always been very, very narrow in his views. And he says that you have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine. Now, transcendental means something that goes above the ordinary world, something that can't necessarily be explained. Um, and he says, "You who have derided your superiors." Derided means make fun of. And in this sense, in some ways, Hyde is almost referring to Jekyll as being a superior to Lanyon. I suppose he would feel that he's superior because he's done some really quite intense scientific development and discovery that Lanyon has always strayed away from. So he's quite rude here. So when he says behold, behold just means watch. So he makes quite a big show of taking the potion in front of Lanyon. He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. The next moment I'd sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, my arm raised to shield me from that prodigy, my mind submerged in terror. "Oh God!" I screamed, and "Oh God!" again and again. For there before my eyes, pale and shaken, half fainting and groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. Now, that is an absolutely vital point in the novel because we are at chapter 9, right at the end of chapter 9 out of just 10 chapters in the book. And it's the first time that the reader has been shown this transformation, the first time that we've realised that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are the same person. And I want you to look at that paragraph, the two paragraphs above it, at the descriptions of the transformation because they are really quite graphic, quite brutal. This isn't some easy transformation. This is something that has a hugely negative impact on the body. So I want you to have a look at the descriptions there. Okay. What he told me in the next hour, I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and my soul sickened at it. And yet, now when that sight has faded from my eyes, I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. So this last paragraph of Dr. Lanyon's narrative is kind of told, obviously, maybe in some time after, or some hours, or maybe perhaps a day or so after he watched the transformation, and he still cannot truly believe what he saw. But as he refers to there, he says, "My soul sickened at it." Because this is something that absolutely goes against kind of God's teaching, I suppose. And we look at the wider picture of the novel, where it looks at this almost like this battle between science and religion that took place in the Victorian era. In our day to day, the church actually very much acknowledges science. It believes that the two do sort of work collaboratively. But back in this time, science and religion could never work together. Okay, and the idea of the soul, the soul is very much a religious concept. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night. I feel that my days are numbered and that I must die, and yet I shall die incredulous. So this is where Lanyon kind of realises that what he's seen has had such a hugely shocking impact on him that he knows that he's going to die. And where he says that I shall die incredulous, incredulous just means in a sense of disbelief. He cannot absolutely, he really can't believe what he saw in his consulting room that night, or whatever it was that Jekyll told him in the hours that followed. And don't forget, we don't know at this point what it was that Jekyll told him in the hours that followed after he watched the transformation. That is what comes into the last chapter. Okay. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even with tears of penitence, I cannot, even in memory, dwell on it without a state of horror. I will say but one thing, Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew. Yours, Hasty Lanyon. So at that point, it's putting a lot of things together for the reader here, and it's reminding us that Hyde, this person or the person that crept into Lanyon's house that night to take the drawer, and who then transformed it into Jekyll, is a wanted murderer. So it's the first time we started to put these pieces together. The fact that it's not just Hyde that's wanted for the murder of Carew, it's in reality Dr. Jekyll. Okay, so you do wonder how he could carry on knowing that Lanyon knows that this man, his friend, is a murderer. And it all hangs on the fact that as Hyde, he reminded Lanyon of the Hippocratic Oath and the fact that he cannot tell anybody about it. So that's why he didn't tell Utterson about it when he was alive, why he's written this all down. And he doesn't necessarily take the secret to his grave with him, because of course he's put all this in his letter, the oath for his death. But certainly he never told anybody about it in his lifetime. So poor Lanyon, the impact that it had on him, not only witnessing something so anti-God, anti-religious, the idea of this transformation of man, this dual nature of man, but also the fact that he knows that he's got to keep the secret that his friend Dr. Jekyll is a killer, is a murderer. And so in some ways it's no wonder that Lanyon does kind of die very quickly after witnessing this, because of the huge considerable impact that it has on him, psychologically and physically as well. Okay, so we've just got one more chapter to go. I'm going to separate the last chapter into two parts, Dr. Jekyll's Full Confession, because it is quite a lengthy one, and it takes us right back to the very start of the story, not the story of with the story of the door, but it takes us right back to the start of Dr. Jekyll's story, in terms of we find out about how he started the experimentation in the first place, and it fills in all of the gaps. But this chapter 9 certainly is very, very important, because first of all, it's not told from the point of view of a third person narrator with a bias towards Utterson. We have a fresh pair of eyes and ears here for the reader, and of course it's Lanyon, who by this point in the book, in terms of the story, is already dead. He died a couple of chapters previous. All right, so this is like his voice speaking from beyond the grave, in the letter that he wrote to Utterson before he died. Okay, and it's also important because it starts to piece together some of the little bits of the jigsaw that the reader is missing. And most significantly, it's the first time in the book that we see Hyde and Jekyll transforming into one another. So that's why this chapter 9 is so important.